The Supreme Court has issued a significant ruling that fundamentally alters the landscape of executive power and trade policy, striking down the core of the administration's tariff program in a 6-3 decision that saw two of the president's own appointees join the majority opinion. The ruling, authored by Chief Justice John Roberts, establishes clear constitutional boundaries on the use of emergency powers for economic policy. The majority held that the administration violated federal law by invoking national emergency authority to impose sweeping, open-ended global tariffs without explicit congressional authorization. The decision represents one of the most consequential checks on executive authority in recent years, with implications that extend far beyond the immediate tariff dispute. Joining Chief Justice Roberts in the majority were Justices Sonia Sotomayor, Elena Kagan, Ketanji Brown Jackson, Neil Gorsuch, and Amy Coney Barrett. The inclusion of Justices Gorsuch and Barrett, both nominated by the president during his first term, has drawn particular attention from legal scholars and political observers alike, highlighting the independent nature of judicial decision-making even when appointees rule against the administration that elevated them to the bench. The court's reasoning centered on the separation of powers principles embedded in the Constitution's trade and commerce clauses. The majority opinion emphasized that while presidents possess certain authorities in foreign affairs and emergency situations, these powers do not extend to unilateral reshaping of American trade policy, affecting virtually every international trading relationship. The ruling effectively restores Congress's constitutional role in setting tariff rates and trade regulations, powers that the Constitution explicitly delegates to the legislative branch. Legal experts have characterized the decision as a significant correction in the balance of power between the executive and legislative branches. Constitutional scholars familiar with the case note that this ruling reasserts a fundamental constitutional principle: that major economic policy decisions require democratic accountability through congressional processes. The decision creates a precedent that future administrations will need to navigate when considering similar uses of emergency authority for non-emergency policy objectives. The tariff program at issue had been implemented through executive orders citing emergency powers, affecting imports from countries across the globe. The administration had defended the program as necessary for addressing trade imbalances and protecting domestic manufacturing, while critics argued that the emergency designation stretched statutory authority beyond its intended scope. The court's ruling effectively terminates the existing tariff structure, requiring companies and trading partners to adjust to a post-tariff trade environment. The economic implications of the ruling are substantial. American businesses that had been operating under the tariff regime will now face reduced import costs, potentially translating into lower consumer prices across various product categories. Industries that had faced retaliatory tariffs from trading partners may see improved export conditions as those measures are unwound. However, the transition period may create short-term uncertainty as supply chains readjust to the new legal framework. International markets reacted to the decision with cautious optimism, though concerns about the administration's response tempered initial gains. Trading partners who had been subject to the tariffs expressed relief at the restoration of more predictable trade relationships, while simultaneously monitoring signals about potential alternative approaches the administration might pursue. The ruling also carries significant implications for the broader architecture of executive power. By establishing clearer limits on emergency authority in economic policy, the court has provided a framework that may influence future litigation involving other executive actions taken under emergency declarations. Legal analysts suggest that this reasoning could affect challenges to executive orders in areas ranging from immigration to environmental regulation, depending on how broadly lower courts interpret the decision's precedential value. Constitutional historians have noted that the ruling fits within a longer tradition of the judiciary serving as a check on executive overreach, regardless of which party occupies the White House. Previous administrations have faced similar judicial corrections when executive actions exceeded statutory or constitutional boundaries, reflecting the Madisonian design of separated powers with mutual checks. The decision arrives at a particularly consequential moment in the administration's second term, as trade policy has been positioned as a central pillar of the economic agenda. The ruling does not prevent the administration from pursuing its trade objectives through alternative means, but it does require those objectives to navigate congressional processes or find narrower statutory authorities that can withstand judicial scrutiny. The administration's response to the Supreme Court ruling has drawn scrutiny from legal scholars, former government officials, and members of both political parties, as the president and senior aides signaled an intent to pursue alternative pathways for implementing tariff policy while delivering sharp public criticism of the judiciary. Within hours of the decision, the president convened a press conference at the White House, where he expressed strong disagreement with the ruling. Characterizing the decision as deeply disappointing, the president singled out Justices Gorsuch and Barrett by name, describing their votes against the administration's position in unusually personal terms. The remarks represented a departure from the traditional presidential practice of maintaining institutional respect for the judiciary, even when disagreeing with specific outcomes. The president's comments directed at his own appointees attracted particular notice. Referring to Justices Gorsuch and Barrett, the president suggested they had brought embarrassment to their families through their judicial votes, a characterization that legal ethicists described as unprecedented in modern American political discourse. Previous administrations, regardless of party, have generally observed norms of restraint when commenting on judicial decisions, particularly those involving justices they nominated. Constitutional scholars express concern about the potential impact of such rhetoric on public confidence in judicial independence. Former federal judges note that the tradition of respecting judicial decisions, even adverse ones, serves a crucial function in maintaining the rule of law. When political leaders attack individual justices personally, rather than engaging with the legal reasoning, it undermines the institutional legitimacy that enables courts to function effectively. The administration's response extended beyond rhetorical criticism to substantive policy signals. Within 48 hours of the ruling, administration officials floated proposals for new tariff structures implemented through alternative legal frameworks. Initial discussions referenced a 10% baseline tariff, with subsequent statements suggesting potential increases to 15% depending on trading partner responses. These proposals appeared designed to achieve similar economic effects through different statutory authorities than those struck down by the court. On social media platforms, the president issued a series of posts warning that nations benefiting from the court's decision would face even higher tariffs than before under alternative implementation strategies. The posts, characterized by emphatic language and capitalization, conveyed an intent to circumvent the ruling's limitations rather than adjust trade policy to comply with the court's constitutional interpretation. The administration also advanced unsubstantiated claims about external influence on the judicial process. Without presenting evidence, the president suggested that foreign interests had affected the court's deliberations, a claim that legal experts dismissed as lacking factual basis and potentially damaging to public trust in judicial institutions. Such accusations, according to former prosecutors and ethics officials, represent a concerning departure from evidence-based political discourse regarding judicial operations. Trade policy experts noted that the administration's threatened workarounds, if implemented, would likely face immediate legal challenges testing the boundaries of whatever alternative statutory authorities were invoked. International trade attorneys observed that the court's ruling was quite clear about the constitutional principles at stake. Simply shifting to a different statutory hook doesn't necessarily resolve the underlying separation of powers questions the court identified. The responses created significant uncertainty for American businesses and international trading partners. Companies that had begun adjusting supply chains in anticipation of tariff relief following the court ruling now face the prospect of new trade restrictions emerging through different legal mechanisms. This uncertainty itself carries economic costs, as businesses delay investment and hiring decisions pending clarity about the trade policy environment. International allies have expressed concern about the stability of American trade commitments. Several trading partners indicated they would monitor the administration's next steps closely while preparing contingency plans for potential renewed tariff disputes. The episode has reinforced perceptions abroad of American trade policy as unpredictable, potentially affecting long-term commercial relationships, regardless of the specific tariff rates ultimately applied. Former officials from both Democratic and Republican administrations have urged the administration to accept a judicial ruling and pursue its trade objectives through congressional channels. Former trade representatives note that if the president believes these tariffs serve the national interest, the appropriate response is to make that case to Congress and the American people. Attempting to circumvent a Supreme Court decision through legal technicalities undermines constitutional governance. The administration's posture has also raised questions about the durability of judicial independence in an era of intense political polarization. Justices Gorsuch and Barrett, by ruling against the administration that appointed them, demonstrated the principle that judicial service entails fidelity to legal interpretation rather than political loyalty. The president's response to their independence has illuminated tensions between executive expectations and the judiciary's constitutional role. The Supreme Court's tariff decision rests on foundational constitutional principles regarding the separation of powers, while its economic consequences ripple through domestic and international markets, affecting consumers, businesses, and diplomatic relationships alike. The Constitution explicitly assigns Congress authority over trade and commerce, a delegation of power that reflects the framers' intent to place major economic decisions within the most democratically accountable branch of government. The administration's use of emergency powers to implement broad tariff policy effectively transferred this legislative authority to the executive branch, a shift that the court found inconsistent with constitutional design. Chief Justice Roberts' majority opinion emphasized that emergency authorities, while necessary for genuine crises, cannot serve as mechanisms for routine policy transformation without congressional participation. This constitutional framework has evolved through centuries of jurisprudence, with courts generally recognizing that presidential power in foreign affairs and emergency situations carries significant weight, but remains bounded by statutory and constitutional limits. The ruling aligns with precedents establishing that Congress cannot delegate its core legislative powers without meaningful standards, and that presidents cannot claim emergency authority where no genuine emergency exists. The court determined that the trade imbalances cited to justify the tariffs, while legitimate policy concerns, did not constitute the kind of sudden, unanticipated crisis that emergency powers were designed to address. Economic analysts have assessed the ruling's impact across multiple sectors. Consumer goods industries, which had faced higher costs for imported materials and finished products under the tariff regime, anticipate price reductions as tariffs are removed. Retail sectors, particularly those dependent on international supply chains, project improved margins and potential expansion of product availability. Manufacturing sectors are divided in their assessments. Industries that benefited from protection against foreign competition may face renewed competitive pressure, while manufacturers that relied on imported components expect cost relief. The agricultural sector, which had been hit particularly hard by retaliatory tariffs from trading partners, stands to benefit significantly from the ruling. American farmers had faced reduced export demand as countries responded to American tariffs with measures targeting agricultural products. The removal of the underlying tariffs provides a basis for trading partners to lift their retaliatory measures, potentially restoring market access that had been constrained during the trade disputes. Labor market effects are anticipated to be mixed. Industries that expanded domestic production in response to tariff protection may contract as cheaper imports resume, potentially affecting employment in those sectors. Conversely, industries that had faced higher input costs may expand operations and hiring as cost structures improve. Net employment effects will depend on the relative magnitude of these competing dynamics, as well as broader macroeconomic conditions during the transition period. International trade relationships face a complex adjustment process. Countries that had negotiated around American tariffs may need to recalibrate their commercial strategies, while those that had retaliated must decide whether to maintain or remove their countermeasures. The World Trade Organization and regional trade bodies will monitor these developments for consistency with international trade agreements, potentially influencing future dispute resolution proceedings. The ruling also affects the broader landscape of executive power and economic policy. Future administrations will need to operate within the constraints established by the court, seeking congressional authorization for major tariff initiatives rather than relying solely on emergency declarations. This requirement may slow the implementation of trade policy changes, but ensures greater democratic deliberation and accountability in decisions affecting the national economy. Financial markets have incorporated the ruling into their assessments of political risk and economic stability. Equity markets initially responded positively to the prospect of reduced trade tensions, though gains were moderated by uncertainty about the administration's threatened alternative approaches. Bond markets reflected expectations of more stable inflation outlooks without tariff-driven price increases. Currency markets saw movements consistent with reduced safe haven demand as geopolitical trade tensions appeared to ease. Long-term investment planning by multinational corporations will be influenced by the ruling's implications for trade policy predictability. Companies that had delayed capital expenditures due to tariff uncertainty may resume investment if alternative tariff threats do not materialize. Conversely, if the administration successfully implements new tariffs through different legal authorities, investment patterns may shift toward jurisdictions with more stable trade policy environments. The ruling's influence extends to the institutional relationship between the executive and judicial branches. By enforcing constitutional limits on presidential authority, the court has reaffirmed its role in maintaining the separation of powers, even when doing so requires ruling against the administration that shaped part of the court's current composition. This institutional independence serves as a critical safeguard against the concentration of governmental power in a single branch. The Supreme Court's tariff ruling sets the stage for several potential developments in American trade policy and constitutional governance, with paths forward that depend on political dynamics, legal strategies, and institutional responses across the federal government. Congress now faces decisions about whether to reclaim its constitutional role in trade policy through active legislative engagement. Some members have indicated interest in developing comprehensive trade legislation that would address the policy concerns underlying the administration's tariff program through statutory frameworks. Such legislation would require bipartisan negotiation and compromise, reflecting the diverse economic interests represented across different states and congressional districts. The prospect of congressional action on trade represents a return to traditional lawmaking processes that the emergency powers approach had circumvented. Alternatively, Congress may choose to delegate certain tariff authorities to the executive branch through carefully crafted statutory language that satisfies constitutional standards. Delegation with meaningful limits and clear standards could provide the administration with flexibility to respond to specific trade situations while maintaining legislative oversight. This approach would require detailed negotiations between the administration and congressional leadership to define the scope and conditions of any delegated authorities. The administration's threatened alternative tariff frameworks face significant legal vulnerabilities. Legal experts have identified several potential statutory authorities the administration might invoke, including provisions of trade law related to national security, unfair trade practices, and reciprocal tariff arrangements. Each of these authorities carries its own statutory requirements and limitations, and any new tariffs implemented under them would likely face immediate judicial challenge. Courts would scrutinize whether the alternative authorities genuinely differ from the emergency powers framework struck down, or whether they represent attempts to achieve the same unconstitutional result through different statutory language. The litigation environment surrounding trade policy is likely to remain active. Business associations, trading partners, and affected industries have developed substantial legal expertise and organizational capacity for challenging tariff measures. Any new administrative actions will face coordinated legal opposition, testing every aspect of statutory authority, procedural compliance, and constitutional validity. The administration will need to devote significant legal resources to defending alternative approaches, with uncertain prospects for success given the court's clear statement of constitutional principles. International diplomatic dimensions will influence the trajectory of American trade policy. Trading partners that had been subject to tariffs may condition normalization of trade relations on sustained policy stability rather than temporary judicial interventions. Bilateral and multilateral negotiations will need to account for the possibility of renewed tariff disputes, potentially affecting the willingness of partners to enter into long-term agreements with the United States. The episode may accelerate efforts by other countries to diversify trading relationships away from American markets, reducing American leverage in future negotiations. The broader political implications of the ruling extend to public understanding of constitutional governance. The episode has highlighted for many citizens the function of judicial review in maintaining checks and balances, even when the resulting decisions are politically inconvenient for the party in power. Educational institutions and civic organizations may use the case to illustrate constitutional principles in action, potentially enhancing public appreciation for institutional constraints on political power. The behavior of the administration's judicial appointees in ruling against the president's policy preferences has reinforced the concept of judicial independence for a public audience. Justices Gorsuch and Barrett demonstrated that appointment by a particular president does not entail ongoing loyalty to that president's policy agenda. This principle, fundamental to the rule of law, has been vividly illustrated through concrete action rather than abstract doctrine, potentially strengthening public commitment to an independent judiciary. Looking ahead, the resolution of trade policy disputes will likely require some combination of legislative action, judicial oversight, and administrative adaptation. The constitutional framework established by the court provides the boundaries within which policy must operate, but significant room remains for legitimate disagreement about optimal trade strategies within those boundaries. Debates about the appropriate level of trade protection, the balance between domestic manufacturing and international commerce, and the role of tariffs in addressing trade imbalances can continue through democratic processes without recourse to emergency authorities. The episode ultimately tests American commitment to constitutional government and the peaceful resolution of political disputes through institutional channels. How the administration, Congress, and the courts navigate the aftermath of this ruling will shape precedents for executive-congressional judicial relations for years to come. The constitutional system provides mechanisms for addressing policy disagreements and correcting institutional overreach. The effectiveness of these mechanisms depends on the willingness of political actors to operate within them rather than seeking to circumvent them. The Supreme Court's decision stands as a significant moment in the ongoing evolution of American constitutional government, reminding that institutional checks remain operative even in periods of intense political polarization. The ruling's enduring significance will be measured not only by its immediate impact on tariff policy, but by its influence on how future administrations understand and respect the constitutional limits on executive power.